Most people thought Anthony Ridley would give up. After all, who wouldn't? One cool March morning, he walked out with a steaming cup of coffee in his hand, expecting a quiet start to the day. But instead of peace, his eyes locked onto something shocking, a brand new fence cutting across his ranch. At the very center of it was a shiny steel gate secured with a padlock. He blinked, thinking it had to be some kind of mistake, but no. The cattle he had dreamed of raising, the ones that were supposed to roam freely, now stood huddled and confused, trapped behind the barrier. The worst part? The only key to that gate belonged to the HOA president, Marjorie Kane. It wasn't his fence. It wasn't even on his land. Yet somehow they had boxed him in like a prisoner on his own property. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some whispered that Anthony would cave, pay the fines, and bow to the rules. But those people didn't know Anthony Ridley. He had fought through storms that wiped out half his crops, through droughts that left the earth cracked and dry, and through long nights nursing sick cattle back to health. But never had anyone tried to steal his freedom with a padlock. Standing in front of that locked gate, Anthony felt anger rise inside him. He knew one thing for certain. If the HOA wanted a fight, they had just chosen the wrong man. At first, he tried to reason with them. He called the HOA office, hoping it was a mix-up. But instead of help, he was told coldly that his fence didn't meet community standards. Until it was replaced, the gate would stay locked. Days later, Marjorie showed up herself, clipboard in hand, her SUV spotless as if it had just left the car wash. She told him bluntly, "You'll follow the rules or you'll stay locked in." With that, she snapped the padlock shut and drove away, leaving Anthony standing in the dust. The fines started soon after, first $50 a day, then $100. Letters came in thick envelopes stamped with the HOA seal. They said his fence hurt community appeal. Anthony laughed bitterly. "I'm raising cattle, not running a resort," he muttered. At the next HOA meeting, he showed up, determined to defend himself. The room was stiff and quiet as Marjorie labeled him non-compliant. But Anthony fired back, pointing out that other houses had mismatched fences, peeling paint, even broken shutters. No one fined them. So why him? Neighbors shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable, but none of them dared speak up. Afterward, one woman named Paula whispered to him in the hallway, "People don't fight her. She buries them in paperwork." Anthony nodded but said nothing. Deep down, he knew he was already too far in to back down. Weeks dragged on and the situation got worse. The fence didn't just block his road. It cut his cattle off from the creek, their main water source. He hauled water in tanks, but it was exhausting and expensive. His herd began to suffer in the heat. Finally, desperate, Anthony confronted Marjorie at her own doorstep. Neighbors peeked through curtains as he told her, "This isn't about rules anymore. You're cutting off my animals from water." But she only replied, "Rules are rules." Then she closed the door in his face. One evening, while scrolling through property listings, Anthony's heart skipped a beat. A small strip of land had just gone up for sale, the very lot where the locked gate stood. His hands trembled as he called his lawyer the next morning. The lawyer confirmed it. If Anthony bought that land, the gate would be his. That night, sitting under the stars, Anthony finally smiled. For the first time in weeks, he saw a way out. He moved quickly, setting up a company under his friend Brett's name to keep his involvement quiet. Marjorie couldn't suspect a thing. While she drove around the neighborhood looking for violations, Anthony kept his face calm, fixing fences, feeding cattle, waving politely. Behind the scenes, the papers were moving. Then one morning, Brett called with the words Anthony had been waiting for. "It's done. The land's yours." 2 weeks later, Anthony stood at the gate with a brand new silver key in his hand. He slid it into the padlock, turned it, and with a satisfying click, the lock popped open. He swung the gate wide, and his cattle walked freely back to the creek. For the first time in months, Anthony felt like he could breathe again. But Marjorie wasn't finished. She arrived with HOA board members and even called in deputies, accusing Anthony of trespassing. Calmly, Anthony handed over his deed. The deputy looked it over, then nodded. "It's his land," he said firmly. Marjorie's face turned red with fury. "This isn't over," she hissed. But it was. The HOA tried lawsuits, threats, even new rules aimed at him. But the tide had shifted. Neighbors began speaking up. Some wore buttons that read "Ridley's right." Others challenged Marjorie at meetings. The fear she had ruled with was gone. Months later, in a packed courtroom, the judge slammed down his gavel. The land belonged to Anthony. The HOA had overstepped and would even pay his legal fees. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, but Anthony only said one thing. This was never about a fence. It was about standing up for what's yours. Back at the ranch, Anthony leaned on the post by the gate, watching his cattle drink from the creek. His old neighbor Glenn walked over with 2 cold beers. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Glenn asked. Anthony smiled. "It's more than that," he said. "When one person stands up, it gives others the courage to do the same." And as the sun dipped low behind the hills, the silver key glinted in Anthony's pocket. A quiet reminder that sometimes the strongest victory isn't about breaking through a lock, but about unlocking freedom itself. Anthony couldn't shake the image of that locked gate out of his mind. Every time he walked out onto his porch, it stared back at him like a challenge. The fence was brand new, its wood polished, its steel posts drilled deep into the ground as if the HOA wanted to make a point. This wasn't temporary. This was control. At first, he tried to stay calm. He called the HOA office, thinking maybe it was all just some misunderstanding. The receptionist spoke with the same rehearsed politeness Anthony had heard from customer service hotlines. "Your fence is not up to standard," she explained in a flat voice. "The community board voted. Until you bring it into compliance, the gate remains locked." "Compliance?" Anthony repeated, his voice tight. "This is my land. My cattle can't even get to the creek. I'm sorry, sir." "That's the decision of the board," she said. And then the line went dead. Anthony's jaw clenched. He wasn't a man who lost his temper easily. But there was something about being dismissed like that, like his voice didn't matter, that lit a fire inside him. The next day, he drove his old pickup truck down to the gate. Workers were still there, putting finishing touches on the fence. "Who hired you?" Anthony asked, stepping out of his truck. "Talk to the HOA," one of them muttered without even looking up. And then she appeared. Marjorie Kane. Perfect hair, sunglasses perched on her head, clipboard in her hand. She looked like someone who ran bake sales and charity auctions, but the steel in her eyes gave her away. She didn't come to talk, she came to enforce. "Mr. Ridley," she said smoothly, "this is for the good of the community. Your fence doesn't match the standards. Until you fix it, the gate stays locked." Anthony took a step forward. "That fence isn't even on your land. It's mine, and my cattle need water from that creek. You're cutting them off." Marjorie's smile didn't move. "Rules are rules. You'll thank us one day." She clicked the padlock shut herself, the sound sharp as a gunshot, then turned and walked back to her shiny SUV. Dust flew behind her tires as she drove off, leaving Anthony standing in silence. That night, Anthony sat at his kitchen table, staring at the fine notice the HOA had slipped into his mailbox. $50 a day, then $100 if he didn't comply. He could almost hear Marjorie's voice saying it. Rules are rules. His neighbor Glenn stopped by. Glenn was a retired trucker, a man who'd seen too much to be rattled by HOA letters. He leaned against the doorway, sipping coffee from a thermos. "She's been pulling this kind of thing for years," Glenn said. "You're not the first she's gone after. She buries folks in fines until they give up." Anthony looked out the window at the gate glowing under the moonlight. "I'm not giving up," he muttered. "Not this time." The fines didn't stop. They came like clockwork, tucked neatly into Anthony's mailbox every morning. First $50 a day, then $100. By the second week, the total was climbing so high it could have bought him a new tractor. Each envelope felt less like paper and more like a slap in the face. Anthony tried to laugh it off at first, but when he sat down to balance his books, he saw the numbers didn't lie. If this kept up, they'd drown him in debt. That was the HOA's plan all along. Bleed him until he gave in. So Anthony decided to do something most people in the neighborhood never dared. He showed up at the HOA meeting. The meeting room was a bland little space in the community center, with folding chairs lined up in rows. The air smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. Neighbors sat quietly, eyes down, whispering to each other. When Anthony walked in, the chatter stopped. He could feel the weight of every eye on him. At the front sat Marjorie, polished as ever, with her clipboard stacked high with papers. She gave Anthony a thin smile, the kind that said, "You won't win here." The meeting droned on about lawn heights and mailbox colors until finally Marjorie cleared her throat. "Next order of business, Mr. Ridley's fence violation." Anthony stood up. His voice was steady, but inside he could feel his chest pounding. I don't understand how my fence is suddenly a problem when half the houses in this community have mismatched boards, peeling paint, even broken gates. None of them were fined. Why me? A murmur rippled through the room. A few people glanced at their shoes. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marjorie didn't flinch. The board voted unanimously. Your fence does not meet standards. You must rebuild it or fines will continue. Anthony's voice rose. This isn't about standards. This is about control. You put up a fence on my property, locked my cattle out of water, and you think I'm just going to sit quietly? The room fell silent. No one spoke. Not even a cough. Marjorie's lips curled into a smirk. The board's decision is final. This discussion is closed. Anthony scanned the room, searching for even one person willing to back him up. He saw Paula, a young mother sitting in the second row. She caught his eye for a brief moment, then looked away quickly. But as people began shuffling out, Paula brushed past him and whispered so quietly he almost didn't hear it. You're right, but she doesn't stop. She'll drag you through court if she has to. That's why nobody fights back. Anthony nodded slowly. Maybe it's time someone did. When he stepped outside, the night air felt heavy. Crickets chirped in the distance and the streetlights hummed softly. He stood there for a long time, staring at the glowing windows of the houses around him. Families were inside, eating dinner, watching TV, living their lives, too afraid to stand up. He realized then that this wasn't just about his fence. This was about every single person in that neighborhood who had been pushed, silenced, and intimidated. The difference was that Anthony wasn't wired to bow down. As he climbed back into his truck, he made himself a promise. He wasn't just going to fight for his land. He was going to fight to break Marjorie's grip on the whole community. It didn't take long for things to get worse. The fence wasn't just an eyesore anymore, it was a chokehold. The creek, the very water source his cattle depended on, lay just beyond the locked gate. At first, Anthony hauled water himself, dragging heavy tanks in the back of his truck. He drove load after load, filling troughs one by one. It worked for a while, but it was exhausting. The days were getting hotter, and he could see the toll it was taking. The herd grew restless, bawling louder each evening. Noses pressed to the fence as if they could smell the water on the other side. One afternoon, Anthony stood by the troughs, sweat dripping from his brow, when Glenn pulled up in his old Chevy. He leaned out the window. You can't keep this up forever, Glenn said. She's waiting for you to crack. Anthony wiped his face with his sleeve. If I stop, my cattle suffer. If I keep going, she wins by grinding me down. Either way, she thinks she's in control. Glenn's eyes narrowed. She's testing you. Wants to see how far she can push. Anthony nodded grimly. He already knew Glenn was right. By the third week, he'd had enough. He marched straight up to Marjorie's house. The neighborhood was quiet. Kids playing in driveways, neighbors watering lawns, but curtains twitched as people noticed where he was heading. He knocked hard on the door, his fists echoing against the polished wood. Marjorie answered, clipboard tucked under her arm, her smile already sharp. Mr. Ridley, she said almost sweetly. What a surprise. Anthony didn't bother with small talk. You've cut off my herd from their only water source. This isn't about rules anymore. This is cruelty. Marjorie tilted her head like she was listening, but her tone stayed cold. You have water tanks. Use them. Anthony stepped closer. You know they're not enough for summer. You're putting my animals at risk. Do you even care? Her smile never faltered. The board makes decisions for the good of the community. You'll either comply or face the consequences. Anthony's voice broke through the quiet street. This isn't the community's land. It's mine. For a moment, no one spoke. Across the street, a man mowing his lawn stopped, resting his arms on the handle of his mower. Two kids paused their game of catch, the ball bouncing into the gutter. Everyone was watching. Marjorie straightened her shoulders. Then maybe ranching isn't the right fit for this neighborhood, she said flatly. Some people just don't belong. And with that, she shut the door in his face. Anthony stood there, fists clenched, his reflection staring back at him in her polished glass window. The door's click was final, like a judge slamming down a gavel. As he turned to walk back down her driveway, whispers carried on the breeze. Neighbors who had watched everything now pretended to busy themselves with watering cans or raking leaves. No one said a word to him. No one offered help. But their eyes told the truth. They were afraid. Afraid of her. Afraid of what she could do to them if they got involved. Anthony climbed into his truck and sat there for a long time, hands gripping the steering wheel. He thought about his father's words from years ago. A man's land is his backbone. You let someone take that and they'll take everything. That night he couldn't sleep. He paced the living room, staring out the window at the gate shining under the moonlight like a constant reminder of his cage. His cattle were restless, lowing in the distance. Each sound cut through him like a blade. He had fought storms, droughts, and hard winters, but this was different. This was someone deliberately trying to break him. And as the hours ticked by, one thing became clear in Anthony's mind. If he wanted to win, he couldn't just fight back harder. He would need to outthink her. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning. Anthony was sitting at his kitchen table, bills spread out, a cup of cold coffee untouched by his elbow. The night before, his cattle had broken through a makeshift trough in desperation, and he'd spent hours patching it back together. He was bone-tired, running on stubbornness alone. The ranch that had once been his dream now felt like a trap. And the fence, the locked gate glinting in the sun, was the daily reminder that Marjorie Kane had boxed him in. But life has a way of dropping opportunities where you least expect them. That morning, Anthony flipped open the local paper. It was habit. He liked checking auctions, livestock ads, farm equipment listings. Halfway down the page, a tiny square of text caught his eye. Lot to 47, small parcel, 0.3 acres. Includes easement rights and access gate. HOA owned. Auction this Saturday. Anthony froze. Lot 47. He knew exactly where that was. His heart began to hammer so hard he had to set the paper down. Lot number 47 wasn't just any parcel. It was the sliver of land where Marjorie's gate stood, the very choke point she used to control him. For a long moment, Anthony just stared, barely daring to believe what he was reading. He whispered to himself, "They're selling the key to my freedom." The irony nearly made him laugh. The HOA, in its endless hunger for funds, was auctioning off the very thing Marjorie had used as her weapon. She probably didn't even realize the consequences yet. By afternoon, Anthony was driving into town, paper folded neatly in his shirt pocket. He stopped by the county office to confirm it wasn't a mistake. The clerk, a tired-looking woman in glasses, pulled up the file. "Yes," she said, tapping the screen. "It's a utility easement lot. Just a patch of dirt with a gate. HOA doesn't want to maintain it anymore." Anthony's jaw tightened. "So whoever buys it owns the gate." The clerk nodded. "That's right. Full rights to the gate and easement." Anthony thanked her, but as he walked out, his mind was already spinning. If Marjorie caught wind of this, she'd shut it down instantly. She'd never let him get near that auction. That night, he didn't tell Glenn, he didn't tell a soul. He sat in the quiet of his living room, lights off, the paper spread on the table like a secret map. The cattle lowed softly outside, restless but alive. And for the first time in weeks, Anthony felt a flicker of hope. But hope wasn't enough. He'd need cash, and he'd need to move carefully. Anthony went through his accounts, his savings, even a dusty cigar box in the closet where his father had stashed emergency money decades ago. It wasn't much, but it was something. He sold an old trailer, cut back every expense, and pulled together every dime he could scrape. Each day leading up to Saturday felt like walking a tightrope. Marjorie still strutted through the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, acting as though she had already won. Anthony kept his head down, hauling water, repairing fences, never once letting on that he knew her entire plan was about to backfire. On Friday night, Glenn stopped by again. "You look different," he said, narrowing his eyes. "Like you know something." Anthony gave him the smallest of smiles. "Let's just say, the storm's about to change direction." Glenn wanted to press, but the look on Anthony's face stopped him. It wasn't defiance anymore. It was something sharper. By the time the sun rose on Saturday, Anthony was already dressed, paper folded neatly in his pocket, checkbook tucked under his arm. He drove into town, heart steady now, like a man walking into battle with a plan no one could see. He knew one thing for certain. If he could pull this off, Marjorie Kane wouldn't just lose her grip on his ranch, she'd lose the very key she thought gave her power. And Anthony? He'd hold it in the palm of his hand. Saturday morning in town buzzed with the usual small-town routine. Families at the diner, kids on bikes, shopkeepers sweeping their sidewalks. But for Anthony, every sound, every face blurred into background noise. His focus was on one place, the county courthouse steps where the auction was set to begin. He parked his truck 2 blocks away, not wanting to draw attention. The folded paper in his shirt pocket felt heavier than a brick. His palms itched, his heartbeat drummed steady but hard. This was it. The make-or-break moment. The auctioneer, a wiry man with a booming voice, stood behind a folding table stacked with files. Farmers, investors, and curious locals milled about. Some came for land, some for gossip. Anthony signed his name quietly on the bidders list, avoiding eye contact, keeping his head low beneath his old hat. He hoped, prayed, that Marjorie had no clue about lot number 47. But hope doesn't keep enemies away. Halfway through the auction, just as smaller lots were being called, Anthony felt the air shift. A hush rippled through the crowd. Turning his head just slightly, he saw her. Marjorie Kane, sharp as a blade in her tailored jacket, clipboard under her arm. She moved with that same confident stride, the kind that told everyone she believed she was in charge, even here. Anthony's stomach sank. Of course she'd found out. She spotted him instantly, her eyes narrowing, lips curling into a smile that wasn't friendly. Then she slid into the crowd, standing just a few feet away. It was no longer a land auction, it was a duel. Lot 45, Lot 46. Each number ticked closer. Anthony barely heard the bids, though voices rang out around him. His whole body was tight, waiting. Finally. Next up, Lot 47, small parcel, easement access includes gate rights. Starting bid $5,000. Anthony raised his hand immediately. 5. The auctioneer nodded. We have 5,000. Do I hear 6? Before he could blink, Marjorie's hand shot up. 6, the crowd murmured. A few locals already guessed what was happening. This wasn't about land, it was a power struggle. 7, Anthony said, voice steady. 8, Marjorie countered. Her chin lifted high, the numbers climbed. 9, 10, 11. Anthony's pulse pounded, but his voice never wavered. Each time he raised his hand with the quiet confidence of a man who had no choice but to win. At 12,000, he felt the weight of his scraped-together savings pressing down on him. This was nearly everything he had. 13, Marjorie said, her voice crisp. She didn't even blink. The auctioneer looked back at Anthony. Do I hear 14? Anthony hesitated. A silence stretched. He thought of his cattle, their low cries at the fence. He thought of his father's words, a man's land is his backbone. He thought of the sleepless nights, the humiliation of standing on his own ranch while locked out like a trespasser. His hand rose. 14. A ripple went through the crowd. Some folks smiled under their hats. Others shook their heads, whispering about how far he'd go. Marjorie's lips tightened. She glanced around as if expecting support, but no one spoke up. For the first time, a crack showed in her polished armor. 15. She snapped finally, voice sharp. The auctioneer grinned. We've got 15. Do I hear 16? Anthony swallowed hard. This was his limit. He didn't have more. Not honestly, not in his accounts. But he also knew something Marjorie didn't. He had a small line of credit from his father's old bank, untouched for years. Just enough to push once more. His hand rose, slow but sure. 16. The crowd held its breath. Marjorie's face flushed red. She opened her mouth, but then stopped. She knew she'd gone too far already. Spending HOA money without board approval would expose her. If she bid higher, people would start asking questions she couldn't afford. The auctioneer raised his gavel. 16 going once? Going twice. Marjorie stared daggers at Anthony, but her hand stayed at her side. Sold. The gavel slammed down. Lot 47 goes to Mr. Anthony Ridley. The crowd broke into quiet applause. A few neighbors clapped harder than they should have, as though relieved to see someone stand up to her. Anthony let out the breath he'd been holding, his chest loosening for the first time in weeks. He stepped forward, signed the papers, and handed over his check with steady hands. When he turned, Marjorie was already walking away, heels clicking sharp against the courthouse steps, fury burning in her eyes. Anthony didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Because in that moment, with the papers in his pocket, he held more than just a lot of dirt. He held the only key that mattered, the one Marjorie could never take from him again. The papers were still warm from the auctioneer's stamp when Anthony drove back to his ranch that afternoon. The sun was dropping low, spilling gold across the fields. His cattle grazed restlessly near the fence, their noses pressed to the rails, waiting as if they knew something was about to change. Anthony pulled into his driveway, cut the engine, and sat for a moment. He held the deed in one hand, the brand new gate key in the other. The metal was cool, but it burned with meaning. Weeks of sleepless nights, backbreaking labor, humiliation. It all came down to this small piece of steel. Word had traveled fast. By the time he stepped out of his truck, neighbors had begun gathering quietly along the road. Glenn leaned against his Chevy, arms folded, eyes bright. Even those who had stayed silent before now stood watching, their curiosity stronger than their fear. Anthony didn't rush. He walked slow, each step deliberate, boots crunching against the gravel as he approached the locked gate. The very symbol of his captivity stood tall before him. The padlock gleamed, mocking him as if daring him to try. Marjorie was there too, of course. She had come straight from town, heels clicking against the pavement as she stormed up the road. She stopped just a few yards away, arms crossed, chin lifted. "This isn't over," she hissed loud enough for everyone to hear. "You think one piece of paper changes anything?" Anthony didn't even look at her. He slid the key into the lock. A sharp click echoed across the quiet pasture. The padlock snapped open, the crowd murmured. Someone clapped once, then stopped as if not sure they were allowed. Anthony pulled the chain free and swung the gate wide. The metal groaned as it opened for the first time in weeks. His cattle stirred, hooves pounding the dirt as they rushed forward, heads dipping to drink from the creek beyond. Their low calls filled the air, a sound of relief, of life. Anthony rested his hands on the open gate, watching them drink. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, not the smile of victory, but of peace. Finally, he turned to Marjorie. His voice was calm, steady, carrying further than he intended. "This gate doesn't belong to you anymore. It doesn't belong to the HOA. It belongs to me. And as long as I'm here, it'll stay open." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Neighbors exchanged looks, some grinning for the first time in weeks. Glenn let out a laugh that broke the tension. Marjorie's face flushed deep red. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. For the first time, her clipboard looked useless, like nothing more than a piece of wood and paper. She turned sharply on her heel and marched away, her power dissolving with every step. Anthony didn't chase her. He didn't need to. Instead, he leaned against the fence, watching his cattle, watching the sun sink lower. One by one, neighbors began stepping forward. A man offered his hand. A woman said softly, "We were rooting for you." Another murmured, "About time someone stood up to her." Anthony nodded, shaking hands, offering quiet thanks. He didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. Because the victory wasn't about proving Marjorie wrong. It was about reclaiming the freedom that had been his all along. As twilight settled over the ranch, the gate stood wide, cattle drinking in peace, neighbors lingering longer than usual as if savoring the moment. For the first time in weeks, Anthony felt his land breathe again. He walked back toward the house, shoulders lighter, the key dangling from his fingers. It wasn't just a key to a gate. It was a key to dignity, to resilience, to the unshakable truth his father had once told him. A man's land is his backbone. And as long as you stand tall, no one can take it from you. That night, the ranch was quiet again, peaceful. But this time, Anthony slept deep, knowing that no matter what storms came next, the gate to his freedom was locked in his hands forever.